Let us begin the press meeting of Prime Minister Ishiba. First off, there will be remarks given by Mr. Ishiba. Mr. Prime Minister, the floor is yours.
Today, 80 years after the World War II and its end, I just issued the views as a Prime Minister. And regarding this year, as I already circulated as a handout to the media outlet, so because of time constraints, so let me just cut back a little bit. This year marks the 80th anniversary after the World War II, and then I myself visited all the war dead memorial sites inside and outside of the country. At the same time, on August 6th, in Hiroshima, I also visited the memorial site for the Avon victims, and on the 9th of the same month, I also visited the peace memorial ceremony in Nagasaki. On the 15th of the same month, I also participated in the nationwide war dead ceremony as well. Why couldn't we stop the war as Japan back then? What kind of law was fueled and was not fueled by politics? And I have had such sense of issue for some time, and I renewed my recognition. And before, in the past, 50 years and 60 years and 70 years after the war, Prime Minister's statements were issued. And about the historical recognition, the historical cabinet views were taken over to my administration. On the other hand, in the past 3 statements regarding why we couldn't stop the war, and on this issue, there was no elaboration. And as for the 70th anniversary statement, it said Japan attempted to overcome its diplomatic and economic deadlock through the use of force. And its domestic political system could not serve as a brake to stop such attempts. So there was such mention, however, no further details were provided in the statement. And no discussion either. And back then, regarding the domestic political system in Japan, why it couldn't serve as a brake to stop such attempts, this time around, in my views which were given this time, there are remaining issues from the past statements, so I shared my views myself, and this is something that I can use to think about the issue together with the Japanese people, and through what background, why Japan went into the war back then. There was a constitution of the Empire of Japan and the government and the diet and the media. I think every one of these had some issue. First of all, let me talk about the constitution of the Empire of Japan. And under this constitution, there was no law regarding the right of supreme control that was considered as something independent military command, and there was no such a thing as an institution, the civilian control. And the Prime Minister was responsible for the cabinet, but however, in order to control the cabinet, there was no authority given to Prime Minister. Therefore, in order to integrate as a politics and the military, and then in order to centralize the will as a nation or as a state, if I borrow the word from Maruyama Masao, the political academic expert, the mediation by extra constitutional entities like Gendo or Jushin, senior officials, there was such a mechanism which was required back then. So that was the institutional issue associated with the constitution back then. And from 1910s and 20s, when Japan went into so-called Taisho democracy, and when that happened, there was a shift of the law of the mediation from Gendo to the political party regarding the integration of the politics and military forces. And as for party cabinet back then, Shidehara diplomacy, and there was such a word back then, as represented in the diplomacy, the imperialistic expansion. In this regard, there was a control back. However, over time, the right of the supreme command was added different interpretation. So the right of the supreme control for the policy as a whole, for the military and the budget and the government and the direct involvement, and as a means of excluding the control and such, the military forces decided to utilize such. And there was a fierce competition of the power between different parties, and over time, the political parties were losing the trust from the people. In 1930, the opposition camp or party called Rikken Seiyukai, in order to shaken or undermine the Rikken Minsei party, they colluded or they collaborated with some part of the Navy, and then for the ratification of the London Navy disarmament treaty, and beyond the operations of military, about the budget and the structure, there was such an allegation made, and then back then they attacked the government back then very fiercely.
In 1935, Minobe Tatsukichi's emperor organ theory was criticized by the Rikken Seiyukai party as a means of attacking the government. Then this escalated into a political issue that also involved the military. Then the Keisuke Okada cabinet attempted to distance itself politically. It said that theoretical issues should be left to scholars. This is the attempt to have political distance. But at the end of the day, the cabinet gave in to the military's demands and pressure, issuing two declarations on the clarification of the national polity, and rejected the emperor organ theory and banning Minobe's books. And thus, the government has lost its control over the military. Next, let me talk about what happened in the Diet. The Diet was supposed to exercise its control over the military, but its function was lost. A good example of this was in 1940, the expulsion of the House of Representatives member, the Saito Takao, in 1940. Mr. Saito criticized the war's escalation and severely questioned the government about the purpose of the war. In response, the army claimed that speech was an insult to the army, and there was very strong protest, and demanded that Saito's resignation. Many Diet members agreed to what the army said, and by an overwhelming majority of 296 votes in favor and 7 votes were against, Mr. Saito was expressed. Nearly 2/3 of the minutes and 61% from the time that remained deleted. While budget and the deliberations were quite important in Parliament's control over the military, the Parliament back then, I cannot say that the Diet then fulfilled its function checking the military budget. In 1942, the second year of the war, and final year of the war, 1945, almost all military expenditures were appropriated to the special account of extraordinary military expenses. When it comes to deliberation on this special budget, the budget document did not include the detailed breakdowns. The deliberations both at House of Representatives and House of Peers were primarily held in closed sessions. The deliberation time was extremely short. We cannot say that this could be called a deliberation. Against this backdrop, the political terrorism underpinned the situation that I have mentioned. from the late Taisho period to early Showa period for 15 years, including 3 serving prime ministers, and many politicians were assassinated by nationalists and young military officers over this period. These incidents, including May 15 incident and February 26 incident, and significantly damaged the environment in which civilians in parliament and government could freely and frankly discuss and act on military policy and budgets, and this is what has happened. Let me talk about the issues about the media. In the 1920s, the media was critical of Japan's international expansion. For example, Tanzan Ishiba, a leading journalist at the time, Mr. Ishiba argued for Japan's abandonment of its colonies in his paper. But after the Great Depression, nationalism spread in Japan. Then intellectual community also began to accept totalitarianism. Then, around the time of the Manchurian incident, the media shifted to actively supporting the war. And this was because war reporting sold and newspapers saw a significant increase in the circulation. And circulation expanded exponentially, and then many people were also disillusioned by this, and leading to the expansion of nationalism. And around the autumn of 1937, the control of the media was then exercised, and there was a ban on the criticism of the government, and there was the widespread logic and to support the war quite actively. We believe there are issues about information gathering analysis situation. It was quite famous that in 1935, and then the Naikaku and Hiraruma Ichiro cabinet, in response to the treatment of the non-invasion between Germany and the Soviet, and said the situations in Europe show a very strange situations indeed, and then the cabinet members resigned. This is a good example of that. The cabinet didn't understand what happened in the world.
Given such a history, now we are living in the modern world. And how can we learn from there? First of all, under the current constitution or Japanese constitution, civilian control is established as an institution or the system, and the SDF is under the command of Prime Minister, and under the Prime Minister, and the integrity or uniformity of cabinet is also ensured. NSS was also established, National Security Secretariat, and then also there was enhancement of total coordination of diplomacy and national security policies. Information gathering and analysis system is also improved. So we have established system. However, it has to be appropriately operated or run. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense. On the side of politics, politics have to really have the capabilities and then the insights to be able to utilize the SDFs. They shouldn't succumb to irresponsible populism. And as for the SDF, so they have to proactively explain itself and then express its own opinions regarding the international affairs, equipment, and operations of forces as expert groups vis-a-vis politics. And politics need to overcome silos, and then they have to really integrate themselves. So without having the integration of the will as a state, the state itself was forced into a war. So we have to really learn from such a lesson. Politics all the time have to consider the benefits and the welfare for the people as a whole, and from a long-term perspective, reasonable decision has to be exercised. And during the war process, we witnessed lack of location of responsibility, and when we are having a stagnation of the situation, even with a less likelihood of success and high risk, brave voices and bold decisions and solutions tend to be accepted. So we should never repeat as a history where we had a wrong course of action without the rational decision and with too much focus on spirituality and the emotional aspect. And number two, the media and the diet have to also give a break to the wrong decision of politics. And in the diet, through the exercise of the authority by the constitution, they have to rightly check the activities of the government. Politics should never be used for protection of self, for parties and party benefits, sacrificing the national interest. And in terms of the media and relations, responsible journalism and healthy speech space is needed. We shouldn't be mired into excessive commercialism and narrow-minded nationalism and discrimination, and such exclusion should never be tolerated. And violence and then also discriminative words should never be tolerated. And number three, we have to really learn from the history. We have to have the integrity, sincerity, and the courage to be able to face the past, and then we have to also have a tolerance to be able to listen with modesty to other people's allegations. The real liberalism and then healthy and robust democracy is needed. Democracy is not perfect as a political format, and before de facto power organization, it has some vulnerabilities. Politicians are civilians, so with a wrong decision, sometimes the state is mired into a war. So therefore, the number of the people with war memory is now dwindling year by year. So now is a time when each one of us, Japanese people, needs to consider proactively about how the peace should be and what happened in the war, to reflect that onto the future, and that way we can solidify the foundation for peaceful nation. And I often quote the words from Tanaka Kakue, and those who went to the war, as long as those people are at the center of the state, we are fine. However, if they disappear, then we have to be scared. So that's why the young people really need to learn from such a learning or such an experience. I think this is quite an important word and phrase for the current Japan. As I mentioned in the UN general debate, without squarely facing the history, we can never see a bright future. So once again, I'd like to reiterate such a message. So with this, I'd like to say this again. So that's it about what I have to say in the beginning.